I think we can start. Joining us today, we have Lotta Hook from University of Edinburgh. She's been researching on Bangladeshi films for quite a few years, about 10 years or more than that. 20, okay, double the number. So she's been researching on Bangladeshi film for about 20 years, and she's currently working on her new book, and that's actually the title of today's topic, I assume. A Screen in the Crowd, the Politics of Mobile Screen in Bangladesh. So yeah, let's see what you have to say. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and for this generous introduction. To Sadia for inviting me and to Drick for hosting me. It's wonderful to be here. It's a real honor. Thank you for coming through the traffic generated by the Belgian Queen. I really appreciate it. So today I just wanted to present you a small bit of the work I'm currently doing. Some of the protagonists, Aro. Okay. Some of the protagonists of this book are in this room. Audrey Desh, Elaita Sen Mamoun, who I've learned a lot from about the Film Society movement. So thank you for being here. It's a real honor for me to be able to share this work with you like this. So what I just want to say is I want to say a few words about the book project and then go into this particular topic, which will be one of the chapters of the book. So the book I'm working on is about the Bangladesh Film Society movement. I approach the Film Society movement very much as an anthropologist. So I'm interested in media as a site of aesthetic, technical, and social practices, more than just an aesthetic form or just a screen. Everything around the screen is the thing that interests me. There are many people who have written very eloquently about the Film Society movement. This is just a tiny pick of some of the people that have. And I build on these important studies to consider the Film Society movement as part of trying to work out how visual culture shapes society. That is really the basic question that has been in my work from the start. In this particular project, I try to add to this existing scholarship to inquire how the social, visual, and aesthetic practices of the film society that have developed over the course of the 20th century particularly can be used to investigate and engage and maybe transform what I call the society of the screen. Now, just in case you thought that the Film Society movement was only happening in the 20th century, just before I came here, I went to Dhaka University to the Film Society to have a look at the festival, our Howard ticket into Hawa. So I think the Film Society is alive and well. People are going around. This was the queue for the 3 short films, creative films and documentaries that are being screened just now at 3:30. It's still going strong. So just some sort of definitions from the project. So what I understand to be this, what I call the society of the screen, I understand this in 2 ways. First, expansively, as the way in which societies globally have been transformed by the arrival of screens in everyday life. A process that, of course, began with the development of new visual technologies in the 19th century, but has gathered pace in the 21st century, as screens have become embedded in everyone's everyday lives and ways of being in the world. In the society of the screen, every social and cultural action has become screen-mediated. A core aspect of what Tiziana Terranova terms the technosocial, that is the society in which digital infrastructure has fundamentally restructured the social. Right? So we can no longer think about society without thinking about the screen. But secondly, and more narrowly, of course, I understand the society of the screen as groups of people or societies that are organized and gathered around screens on which are projected selected films and which generate particular forms of social practice. These are film societies proper. So if film societies once emerged to give its paying members access to national and international art films that were unavailable in commercial cinema halls, today, everyone has a screen in their pocket, and both classic and new releases are a mere search away. In these changed contexts, does the Film Society still have any relevance? Now, in the book, I will argue, I hope, that we can understand the society of the screen through ethnographic attention to the practices, ideas, aesthetics, and social forms of film societies. Given the ways in which film society activists in Bangladesh and elsewhere have been preoccupied by films and screens, and as they have theorized the practices and the relationship between film and society, I believe that film societies are indeed a very useful starting point to investigate and understand our contemporary society of the screen. And the book builds on ethnographic fieldwork that I've been carrying out since 2013 with different film societies and enthusiasts in Dhaka and around. My premise is that a close ethnographic society to film society practices in Bangladesh allows a consideration of the ways in which the screen shapes social life much more broadly. Now, the book will engage 4 key terms in the contemporary discussion of digitally mediated screen-based societies, which are the spectator, so the person who watches the film, the screen, here are some, non-theatrical exhibition in particular, surveillance or censorship by the state, and platforms, that is, new types of financial and infrastructural support for the circulation of the moving image. So these are the 4 chapters of the book. And today I want to look at the second one, the question of the screen. So let me start by reading this paper. So I'm sorry to read, but it's just my way of dealing with the material that is so extensive. Okay, so in January 2014, a large group of activists started a journey from the Bangladesh capital, Dhaka, to the northern city of Thakurgaon. Among the marchers were political, student, and youth activists, as well as workers from cultural organizations, photographers, and filmmakers. This broad coalition traveled under the banner of the Gonojagran Mancho. Their purpose was to protest the violence against Hindus that had erupted in Thakurgaon and elsewhere in the country in the wake of the contentious elections held on the 5th of January 2014. Along the way, the group stopped for rallies and meetings. At the end of the first day and in the morning of the second, the marchers were attacked. Bricks and what newspapers described as quote-unquote crude bombs were thrown at the bus. We had a rally at Rangpur Town Hall, said Belayat Hussein Maman, who's sitting right here. So I'm ventriloquizing your words. And we were on our way to Nilphamari when we heard that the buses in the rear had been attacked by petrol bombs, unquote. As you all know, of course, Mamun Bhai is the founder-director of Moviane Film Society and had been actively engaged as a cultural activist in the political mobilizations and protests that had been ongoing in Bangladesh. Now, Mamun was speaking on the phone, which is where I heard this conversation, with Morshidul Islam. He had rung into the television program Shumpa Dokyo, a talk show on Shumoy TV that was hosted that day by the filmmaker Morshidul Islam, who you will all know. Morshid Bhai asked, "Where are you now?" And Mamun Bhai said, "We are at Dinajpur District Shilpakala Academy." So his normally relaxed and cheerful voice sounded tense as he relayed the details of the attack in a hurry. We had been vigilant throughout the journey, he said, and had kept the windows of all the buses closed. That is why the bombs exploded outside and not inside the bus. The bus is damaged, but it did not burn, unquote. Now, the guests with Morshid Bhai in the studio that day were introduced, all of them, as cultural workers, Shongskriti Kormi. They were Rukia Prachi, who you know from films such as Dukhai and Matir Moina, Nasiruddin Yusuf Bacho, who of course co-founded the Dhaka Theatre in 1973 and director of many films, and the current Director General of Shilpakola, Liaquat Ali Lucky. Now, the 4 of them had gathered in the studio to discuss the role of the cultural movement in creating a non-communal Bangladesh. That was the title of the program that day. And opening the conversation, Bachuhai immediately placed cultural activists and cultural movements at the heart of the very political mobilizations in the 1950s and 60s that would eventually become the struggle for Bangladesh's independence. The guests in the studio that day all agreed culture had always played a profound political role in Bangladesh, and it could do so again now. Now, the cinema and the film society movement have been active participants in public contestations at moments of heightened political conflict in Bangladesh. Whether in the years leading up to independence, during the 80s, in the 90s, the 2010s, film society activists have been there. Participants in articulating protests, raising awareness, alongside other cultural activists in Bangladesh's many social movements. Most of the time, however, the practices of film societies in Bangladesh are focused on film screenings and collective viewing that is largely contained in festivals and small-scale screenings. I'd like to discuss today what happens at certain crucial moments when the film societies burst their banks, so to say, and they emerge in the public domain as part of larger political mobilizations and broader coalitions. A closer ethnographic look at these societies illustrates the intersections between cinema and social change, in which textual and aesthetic forms are springs to action for activities around the screen that call into being publics and modes of reception that may or may not be in sync with the aspirations of the political protest that they participate in, right? And we'll come to discuss a few examples of this. Thinking the Film Society movement's outdoor screenings alongside similar and adjacent practices of outdoor and mobile cinema elsewhere in Asia is particularly useful to me to probe the contemporary place of the improvised outdoor screening as a modular political form. And so I will try and draw a little bit on the discussions on the nature of the crowd within post-colonial Asia to ask what the place of the moving image and the mobile screen is within such a crowd. And I will argue that while film screening in and through film societies is part of the domain of the political in Bangladesh, by its very crowd-like nature, it is unpredictably tethered to aspirations for social and political transformation. So some weeks after Mamun's breathless account on Shomoy television, I visited the offices of the Dhaka University Film Society at TSC. The room occupied by Duffs was lined with glass-fronted bookcases, and the spare wall space was decorated with framed film posters and flyers from the society's events and screenings. A number of students leaned over the heavy wooden table that took up most of the space in the room. They turned the pages of a picture book excitedly. The book, titled Jonagorana Kotha, was edited by Shami Haq and contained photographs from the 2013 protest at Shahbag. Published on the occasion of International Women's Day, the photographs were all of women during the protest, some of whom were named in the captions, and some of whom, interestingly, were not. The students exclaimed and chatted excitedly as they came across portraits of friends and comrades, bringing up small anecdotes and reminiscing of those heady days of the year past. Among the many portraits, there we go, one of my protagonists. Among the many portraits, we see Audrey Hidesh at Shahbag, lifting the camera above her head as she tries to document the movement as it is unfolding. And in another photograph, we see Reshmi Ahmed, who's of course the founder of the Bangladesh Documentary Council, shown with her fist raised. And so these are two separate pages in this small book. Now, in the year following the protest, Reshmi Ahmed made a documentary film titled Amar Protibad, documenting the events of February 2013 and reflecting on her own life's trajectory leading up to participation in those protests. In the longer cut, so there's two cuts of this film, and there might be reasons that I don't know why these two cuts exist, but we can discuss maybe later. So in the longer cut of the film, Amar Protibat opens with a nearly 3-minute long montage of still images, layering scenes from the 2013 Shahbag protest with iconic images of the War of Independence and the People's Courts in the early 1990s. And this is all set over just one song track. Only after this montage does a voiceover start. The voice narrates Ahmed's life, starting with her mother's purchase of a house in Old Dhaka from a Hindu man departing from Kolkata. The voiceover is recorded by Shamin Akhtar, one of the most significant female independent filmmakers, of course, who is also interviewed in the film itself. Akhtar's voice and Ahmed's life are set against new and archival footage and still photographs that document the major political transitions by which the ideals of the liberation war are pushed aside, and we know what happens next. The film is punctuated by a statement voiced by Akhtar in the guise of Ahmed that keeps repeating, Ami protibad korte parine. I was unable to protest. This statement closes out each sequence narrating a particular set of personal and political events. The film's refrain, however, changes. I'm sorry if all of you have seen this film, and this is quite tedious, but just in case you haven't. The film's refrain then changes in the sequence of the film that tracks the movement for Bengali culture, which was spurred by the demolition in 2008 of a new but unfinished public sculpture at the roundabout at the airport. Now I'm going to see if I can show you this clip, which might be nice not to have to hear me. Let me see if I can play this. You want to hear it?
জিয়াউর রহমানের দল বিএনপি ও জামায়াতে ইসলামী রাজাকারেরা তখন ক্ষমতায়। এমন একটি সময় আসলো যুব সমাজ আর বসে থাকতে পারেনি। দেখতে গেলাম আমার বন্ধুরা মিলে প্রতিবাদ করছে। লালন চত্বর ঘোষণার দাবিতে তারা প্রতিবাদ গড়ে তুলল। বাংলার সংস্কৃতির আন্দোলন। তারা প্রতিবাদ করলো, কিছু দাবি তুলল। ক্যামেরা নিয়ে নেমে পড়লাম। দেখি কিছু করা যায় কিনা। ধন্য ধন্য বলে তাদের, ধন্য ধন্য বলি তাদের, বেঁধেছে এমন ঘর, বেঁধেছে এমন ঘর, শূন্যের উপর পচতা করে। ধন্য কোথাকার মানুষ?
Okay, so I just wanted to get to this point where you see a sort of collage of all these different types of art forms that have been gathered together at this point in 2008 around Dhaka University, and the ways in which it gathers different types of people that you will recognize to engage with this. And so the voiceover at the end of the film, so the film goes on for many minutes after this, and finally it concludes that I took to the streets with my camera and at last I protested. Ami camera niye beriye porlam, oboshesh ami protibad korlam. So the film for me is interesting because it allows this sort of view of the cultural movement as a spring to other types of political intervention. Now the students at Dhaka University Film Society pointed out all the familiar faces in the book and told me about their experiences in 2013. As Film Society activists, with their offices just there, at the central site of the protest, they had been actively involved. We ran free screenings at Shabak, said one of the students, when we sat down to discuss the activities of the Film Society. They'd put up a screen outdoors and in the evening screened films related to 1971, such as Stop Genocide, which we also saw just now, Muktirgan, and many other films. Quote, everyone brings something of themselves to the protest, the students had continued. We are a film society. We protest with film. Amra film niye andolon kori. So this perception was shared by different members of the group. And I just want to, this is one of the previous directors, I guess, of the Dhaka University Film Society, chair people, who in a different context and previous to this moment, but at the same time that I went to see them, so this is after Shabak, but before the current moment, tells me why film screening is so important. I think this is quite a helpful way of trying to think about it. So I just want to give him a little bit of...
মানুষকে অযাচিতভাবে অনুপ্রেরণা দেয়, অযাচিতভাবে ভাবায়। আমি আমার আমার অজান্তেই আমাকে ভাবাবে। হ্যাঁ, তো এটা কি সবচেয়ে বেশি কি গুরুত্বপূর্ণ আমার মনে হয়। মানুষকে ভাবানোটা, মানুষের চিন্তার বিকাশটা খুব জরুরি। চিন্তার বিকাশ যতই আমরা করতে পারবো এবং যত চিন্তার ডাইভার্সিটি পাবো, আমার মনে হয় ততই আমরা একটা ভালো সমাজ পাবো, ভালো সোসাইটি পাবো, ভালো মানুষ পাবো। যারা হচ্ছে সমাজ পরিবর্তন করবে বা যারা হয়তো সমাজ নিয়ে ভাবে তাদেরকে নাড়া দেওয়ার জন্য আসলে হয়তো সিনেমাটা অনেক গুরুত্ব
Cinema tareke nara dibe. I like this idea that they will push them forward with a very creepy Shotiji Ray right behind him there. Okay. Now, in a way, in different film society, different members of film societies, different people that have different types of commitment to the film society movement, all of them at some point or another have told me about the power of film to impress itself on viewers and the responsibilities that created for them as film society activists. To screen films at the protest was to participate in the movement, to raise awareness, stir up sentiments via war films, and quote unquote take control the terms of the debate. They knew that, quote, publicity allows for mobilization of subjects at effective, performative, and cognitive registers, unquote. For a film society, then, protesting with film meant that at times of public crisis, political conflagration, or searing injustices, public film screenings did have a role to play in galvanizing action and raising awareness. Like Reshmi Ahmed's decision to take her camera in hand and join in, at such moments, film society activists too came out into the streets and joined with their projectors, USB sticks, laptops, and white-coated sheets attached to bamboo poles. Now, the convictions about cinema's place and efficacy in social and political mobilizations ran deep at the Dhaka University Film Society. The Students' Film Federation had been set up at Dhaka University in 1963, and the same year the Pakistan Film Society, what would become the Bangladesh Film Society, was founded. These film clubs and many of others, like Argenta and many others, came alongside these. These clubs and others that were set up over the years focus on screening and discussing films, mostly internationally renowned, and whatever reels then passed through various diplomatic circuits in Dhaka, which was a major source of celluloid. The active members of these society have become to be described as film activists for their commitment to the screening and discussion of films by which access to these texts and modes of engaging them could be realized and shared, building a social and intellectual life around film text and cinema as a social and ritual practice. Key activists moved between the societies, reviewing films for newspapers, publishing periodicals related to the societies and films, as well as across other domains of art, including literature, painting, and drama. The magazines and periodicals that they published over the years give real insight in who populated these societies, and films that were screened and themes that animated their discussions. And somebody like Zainul Abidin was the chair of the first film society, so there's a huge interconnection between all the different visual arts. This belief in the social power and efficacy of cinema was expressed in its full artistic potential. This really was a shared assumption across these different fora. And the gathering storm of popular unrest and military rule in the 1960s, alongside the long-standing left political engagements of many of the society's key figures in the 60s, pushed the conceptualization of cinema as a political tool that would find expression in Stop Genocide and has since animated the film society movement. Now, this set of ideas comes very forcefully. Sorry, I think the text is way too small for you to read, but you know this publication, so I guess it's not as urgent. In this issue, the film text and director's vision were placed at the heart of the political potential of the cinema, in registers familiar from left political tropes of the transformative and revolutionary potential of the arts. Alongside the text and vision, however, was the understanding that the unlocking of these texts required the introduction of the films to audiences out with the capitalist frames of film production and distribution interest, who were in any case not giving access. So it was very easy to make that statement because cinema halls were not interested in screening these films. The generation of film activists writing in Kamera Jokon Rifle, under the guidance of Kobir, but with the inspiration of the late Raihan, would reshape this film society's practices of exhibition and embrace a mobile projection format to screen films that they made themselves, often on 16mm. While the film societies had been operative since the 1960s as a set of film clubs screening a canon of international art films for a small group of connoisseurs, its form changed in the 80s with the arrival of relatively cheap, relatively being the key word, 18mm. So here are some citations from the short film form manifesto from 1988 that I will allow you to read if you can, while I have another sip of water. So what I think is interesting here is that 16mm has a revolutionary potential, and it can even go to the open field. These are, I think, the two key, and that's why I've emphasized it. These are the two key terms here. So the availability of 16mm projectors in the countryside doubled its promise by allowing young filmmakers to open what the forum literature describes as the second channel, that of non-theatrical exhibition. Through this channel, the new filmmakers could avoid the closed networks of commercial distributors who kept films such as Shurja Diglbari from releasing in the main cinema halls in the country. Instead, here was another site of projection. Thank you, that is very sweet. So, speaking to Tanvir Mokamel, for example, he stressed to me the capillary network of enthusiasts and organizers that would materialize the possibility of projecting short films in school fields and village mats. He explained the efforts of film societies and the cultural front of the Communist Party to screen his 1984 film Hulia alongside Morshidul Islam's Agami, as seen here. These films inaugurated the turn towards filmmaking within the film society movement in the 80s, and both of these films spoke allegorically about the conditions of freedom and the possibilities of liberation, as Famida Akhtar has argued. Now, the entry of the makeshift screen into the public domain, paradigmatically the village field, stands quite removed from the individually embodied pleasures and modes of encountering the commercial cinema, and instead posit the relationship of the screen to the collective. On the one hand, films screened in this way are often explicitly political, nostalgic, or pedagogic. The inscribed spectator of such a film is already often a collective: unionized workers, farmers, slum dwellers. On the other hand, the encounter with the makeshift cinema is premised on the possibility of the audience as a collective body due to the sites of its screening. The public path, a space without individually levied tickets, through which one moves as part of a public. More than being merely affordable, as an ideal then, 16mm was capable of making the abstract category of the people appear full and concrete before it. Entering into the village, both to shoot and screen, the 16mm cameras and projectors created a tangible means by which film activists felt they could reach out to the people and gather them together. And I don't think I have a slide of this. Yeah, I do. This one. So just the other day, Molla Shagar was telling me that his film Dud Koila was screened in Fulbari outside the main cinema hall in the city or in the town on these 40 feet double improvised screens as part of the movement. And so filmmakers have always been active in these sites and have mobilized the possibilities of the screen. And so listening to him tell of the ways in which their local activism allowed this huge crowd to emerge to see this film. And this is some months before the shootings occurred there. So this crowd was intact in a way. I think gives a real sense of the ways in which this type of practice as a modular form is available for different types of mobilization. But there was, of course, always already a second channel of film exhibition in Eastern Bengal. Inheriting both policy and infrastructure from the British, the Pakistani government was quick to harness the political potential of the cinema in the late 1940s and early 1950s as it tried to instantiate the new state. Its public relations department utilized mobile publicity units to, quote, this is from the archival documents, address public meetings and group gatherings, and to screen documentary films of the government's achievements and pioneering works to inspire the people, unquote. By the mid-1950s, the East Bengal Board of Centers was also struggling to review the many educational short films that were being imported by the foreign missions in Dhaka and screened by the USIS, the British Information Services, and the Indian High Commission, which, for those interested, was bringing in a lot of the Indian government films to be screened here. And I think there's an amazing project to be done on that. So the point of this is to say that the political potential of the second channel of distribution and exhibition was always already wide open. Now, the use of the second channel and the harnessing of cinema's capacity to emerge in public domains outside the cinema halls in temporary and improvised conditions with explicit political intent and a great orchestration of bodies before the screen continues to be available as a modular form. And here again we have on by. So film societies in the 21st century have inherited the practices and ideals of the film societies that have developed in Bangladesh since the 1960s. And this is where Chobihat used to be, which of course a major site for public, non-theatrical, open-air exhibition when it was still in being. So the question really is, how is it that this moving image that is mobilized then in the sight of the crowd, among often many other types of styles and forms of publicity by which subjects are moved and mobilized, what is it that the moving image and this mobile screen is doing there amidst these crowds? Now, the open-air improvised and mobile screening has been a site for imagining the types of cinema and sorts of spectatorship that emerge at its shifting sites in the context of various explicit political projects. In their respective discussions of open-air film screenings in 20th century China, Li and Zhu both emphasize, and so these are film scholars working on the socialist Chinese cinema, they emphasize that what is on the screen is only one aspect of the wider social and material environment around the open-air screen. Quote, one dimension of cinematic experience, which open-air cinema particularly foregrounds, is the air, or the overall atmosphere of an exhibition space that engages viewers through multiple senses, unquote. Lee calls this hot noise, quote, a broader sensory environment, ambience and vibe, unquote. Working from accounts of memories of mobile cinema in mid-20th century China, both Zhu and Li ask how this immersive and extended experience might recalibrate what we understand as cinema and the forms of spectatorship that this makes possible. Quote, instead of drawing audiences into the film in a centrifugal fashion, Chinese mobile cinema created an electrifying environment that radiated outwards, entangling viewers in a centripetal movement, unquote. Now, Zhu calls this atmospheric spectatorship, a mode of cinematic experience that does not privilege the film as an object of attention, but is characterized by presence in an experiential milieu that surrounds the viewer. And I think this is very helpful for our purposes. May Adadol Ingawani has also discussed this type of itinerant makeshift cinema in Thailand, looking at the ways in which USIS vans would take around not just films, but all sorts of objects and show them. And then these would get entangled with other types of ritual practice. So it would happen alongside a temple or in a particular type of, under a particular type of tree, and that all of these human and non-human aspects would come to constitute. So the literature on mobile cinema is largely historically focused, right? So this type of open air screening and its tumultuous surrounding is considered to be a vanished scene. So what it studies often is historical audiences. And they're and so these audiences are conjured from archival text rather than from ethnographic encounters or interviews or journalistic moments, to try and figure out what happens in the thick of the crowd that gathers. Well, evidently, the screen is now privately held in most people's hands and pockets. In fact, the collective effervescence generated by a public screening and a collective viewing allows the large mobile screen to retain its modular form of the moving image within the mass politics. Nusrat Chowdhury has argued for the crowd as the site of mass politics in Bangladesh, where the large-scale gathering is, according to her quote, a repository of the nuances of post-colonial sovereignty, where the popular and the uncivil come together, unquote. So when the activists of the Dhaka University Film Society rig up their screen, they are reprising the long-standing practice of mobile cinema and its capacity to animate the atmosphere within a dense crowd, conjuring feelings, collectivity, specters, and histories in a space where image, sound, screen, and crowd align. Their screening within the crowd illustrates the dual aspects of reflexive mediation and embodied action in popular politics. In such context, Chowdhury argues, quote, the border between the citizen and the member of the unruly crowd are hard to maintain, unquote. It's what she calls the crowd as a force of politics. And it is there that the possibility of the political in open-air film exhibition emerges. But what exactly happens to the relationship between the film text, the screen, and the spectator in such a crowd? And that's, of course, ultimately what I'm after. So evidently the moving image within the crowd is not about immersive spectatorship and transparent representation. This is what the historical account of the mobile cinema underscore: the centripetal force of the moving image, by which the political messages of the film text are refracted through atmospheres thick with bodies, sounds and images that all else that surrounds the screen, both synchronically and diachronically. In this crowd, imperceptible potentials emerge in a tangle of representations and practices, generating political affect, constituted by, quote, a mix of corporality and public feelings. This is all from Nusrat's work. So, more than clear articulations by recognizable actors whose claims emerge apparently unmediated and transparently from its grounds, and unlike the plentiful digital giant screens that beam advertising films and government messages at commuters as they idle in Dhaka's traffic jams, the moving image projected by protesters in the crowd are received in a centripetal manner, entangling rather than communicating to them. It echoes and amplifies the spirit of the war, making it audiovisually present in the body of the crowd. Chowdhury highlights hearsay, accident, and excess as the form that such potentials take within the crowd, and that then lead to political action. So this is what the moving image in the mobile screen in the crowd provides: immanent potentials, animated by the moving image, that channel forces between the human, the material, and the spectral. It is within the hot noise of the crowd that excess and misrecognition emerge as forms of interpellation by the screen. Now, one of the films that was screened at Shabak was, of course, Muktirgan. This hugely significant film, of course, reconnected younger generations to the struggle, and it became a staple of 1971's war cinema genre, and now, of course, frequently screened at important national calendar dates. The focus in the film on the political contributions of a cultural group in the collective struggle made it especially poignant as a choice at that time. Among the singers in the group was Lubna Miriam, who had participated in the war effort in 1971 and whose younger brother had been a liberation fighter. A witness to the war's atrocities, he'd committed suicide. Mariam's response to Shabak had been rooted in her experiences of the war and the devastations it had wrought. Refusing to join the calls for more violence and death in Shabak's central demand for the death penalty, she became a target for virulent criticism and abuse online. In a short reflection on the illiberal politics unfolding at Shabak, Naima Hyman wrote, quote, "As I read harsh comments directed against her online, including a brutal poem by an author I used to admire, I wondered if anyone remembered that the film playing in the background of Shabak's giant screen was Muktirgan, and the two women in the singing troupe were Lubna Miriam and her sister Naila Shattar." Unquote. The details of the film disperse and evaporate as the film's mode of address is transformed through its site of projection. Despite the screen's massive visibility, the activities of the Film Society should therefore be understood as part of Chowdhury's imperceptible politics. A dispositive emerges, of which the screen and the moving image, the film activists and their curations form one small part. The point is not that the spectators are not paying enough attention, but rather that the screen in the crowd encourages a particular type of atmospheric spectatorship that has a role in fanning the possibilities of this imperceptible politics that is immanent within the crowd itself. Rather than a nostalgic form now lost, the mobile screen in the crowd is part of the deep mediatization through which contemporary popular politics articulates itself. It is a modular political form and a symbol where, quote, "the embodied act of collectively sharing and extending a message is more important than the information loss that occurs in the process," unquote. It's my last paragraph. I'm going to get there. A year after the spectacular political crowds had gathered at the Shabak intersection, Moviana Film Society organized a set of film screening outside the National Museum to commemorate the events. Titled Shabak Andaloner Cholochitro Cholochitre, Shabak Andalon, the event combined talks with a series of public screening of new documentaries outside the public library. As part of those screenings, Reshmi Ahmed's Amar Protibat was screened outdoors. The crowds of the last year had faded away, but smaller groups of spectators gathered, sharing in that Film Society collectivity of dedicated cinephiles, film activists, friends of friends, accidental passers-by, and lots of sweet tea. Despite the dissipated effervescence, the Film Society activists continued on with their activities. They would continue their Andalon, their movement, sharing and spreading modes of gathering around the screen as it erupted into public spaces among small and large crowds. Thank you for your patience.
All right. Thank you, Lotta. I think we can open the floor for questions.
Hi, everybody can hear me. Lotte, it's just some questions and comments because we have been researching in kind of the very close fields. Lotte, what are the four chapters actually, thematic chapters that you have mm, divided? These are, could you please repeat it right now? What are those? Yeah, what are those? Yeah, can you just tell?
The four chapters are The Spectator, which is an ethnography of film appreciation. So, how do you teach film appreciation, but especially what happens to you when you submit yourself to film appreciation? The second chapter is Screens, which is about, this is one section of that, about the public screen in the non theatrical exhibition, the second channel. The third is this, which is the Film Club Registration and Regulation Act, which is really about surveillance, a mode of surveillance of people gathering around the screen, which has always been considered problematic. And the fourth is something that at the moment I'm calling platforms, which is about the ways in which types of funding and distribution come together to allow certain types of films to emerge within the broader art film circuit. Those are the ones.
Thank you so much. So one key comment in that section, one key part I'm really interested is that because as I've been the embodiment and the social media efficacy that you have been talking about, this efficacy of the mobile cinema movement, as you have been researching in this field, so now screens are, I'm holding a screen, we are in front of a screen, these are going towards the screen. So from your research, what do you think that even in the offline physical space, which creates this hybrid sociality, online and offline, both cases, what if film movement, film society movement is taking part of that, even the screening is there, even the screening is there, and we are having exposed to multiple screens, why, in your understanding, then, in the physical space, the political efficacy that used to be common to us, that I guess you have found already, your because 2008 Lalon Murti Opasharan was the case, very much so. Why it is moving? Now we are surrounded by screens. Now we are screen-mediated reality that we are living, both of the cases. So from your, I want your insight in the Bangladeshi case, after Shahbag movement and so forth. What tweaked, what changed, that you felt like, okay, these might be, the society is there, engagement is there, right? But before and after, we both as a researcher can feel the shift. So surveillance is a very good one point. You can explore, you should. And now my comment, these are the question, what your insight is. My comment is, if you're only focusing methodologically the art film or film society movement, then 2016 onwards, Bangladeshi youth, in a way, and in a definitely not only center, turned into OTT platforms, not only as entertainment, but creating digital sociality of them as well. So Moviana Film Society, at the same time, Cinema Core Group, these are the ways they are discussing sociality moving around. So are you planning to include this part, or is this in your scope, or we could study together? So thank you so much. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Yeah, sure. So I think there's many things to say. Um, So I think that one of the things that we have to understand about our contemporary society is that just as previously, our media extensions shaped the experience of our lives. So the coming of cinema is all about the ways in which it allows us to access the nature of the new city, of modernity, of new types of sociality, as the cinema hall, for example, allowed, in the context of South Asia, new types of classes and castes of people to mingle in new types of spaces. In the same way, social media have come to transform the ways in which we experience what you're calling here the offline. So I don't think that distinction, like media are always shaping the ways in which we inhabit the world. At the moment, these are digitally extended in new ways, and we have lived through the shock of that in the same way that people have lived through the shock of the arrival of cinema. So I think we are particularly well positioned to reflect on this. Now, I think that while OTT may have changed my thing, so one of the things, of course, is that I'm not a film studies scholar. So the film text to me is interesting because of the ways in which it gathers people. And what I see happening is that, you know, like I think this is always things don't change so quickly. So even something like Pet Kata Shah, which is, you know, on an OTT platform, is being screened as a feature film at the Rotterdam Film Festival. So what is that? And why is it, I mean, it's drawing a huge crowd and it's done extremely well there. So there's still something about the ways in which people want to gather around the screen, and that has not really changed. Exactly. Hello. Yes. So there's many ways in which that happens. And then I think that for me, the film society movement is particularly interesting because here are people who are continuously imagining, conceptualizing, and practicing their relationship to the screen in a super conscious manner, which I find really inspirational, where people are sitting around trying to understand Api Chakpong Virasataku's film. Now that is, that is something. I saw it for the first time, in fact, with a very small group of people that were trying to do some autodidact film appreciation at Drick. There were 7 people in the room, and we sat through it for the whole 2 hours, 5 minutes that it went on, and then we discussed it. It was, it was sort of extraordinary experience, right? So I think that the reason why I'm interested in the film society movement is not necessarily because I think they have a particular type of superior efficacy, but it is a super conscious movement and always has been asking the questions about these types, whether we're talking about the 80s or the 60s. Almagir Kabir wrote extensively about, what the place of the cinema was in the late 1960s when he was writing for Holiday or the Pakistan Observer. And so that's why I'm interested in the movement, not because I think that somehow here I will find the answers to the nature of a digital society, but here I will find people who have a very clear sense of how they relate to the screen. And that's what I think is very worthwhile in engaging with.
You pointed out that to understand what happens at the interface or the spectacular atmospheric spectatorship, you said that you wanted to look at the crowd or the thick of the bodies or thick in the bodies rather than the ethnography. So my question is, what do you look at the crowd? So do you more or less align with the sensorial turn in media studies or audience studies? Or then again, what you call the emergence of modular political forms. Could you please mention some concrete examples of certain kinds of modular political forms that have emerged in the screen culture over the years? Thank you.
So thank you for those really brilliant questions and really useful ways of trying to think through exactly what the project is. So for me, and so this project came out of my earlier work on cut piece cinema, which was, of course, one of the things that was difficult about doing that work was that you're sitting in a very densely populated cinema hall where people are very intensely watching the screen because of, pornography does something to the visceral experience, right? And especially when you're in a collective, think about when you see, maybe slightly overly romantic things with a family member and suddenly you just feel all your senses come alive. So can you imagine if you're watching pornography in a cinema hall with lots of people in it, it's a very visceral experience. The thing that frustrated me as a scholar was that experience is very hard to get access to. So you can't then say, cholo ekta chai খেয়ে যাই কি দেখেছেন কেমন লাগছে, you know, that it's quite difficult to then get to that experience. So the only way you can really describe it is through your own experience. So this is why I became interested in the film society movement, because there you have people that are very stimulated by particular type of film text. They watch Ozu, they watch Versataku, they watch Kotok, and they come away enervated somehow, right? And so it's interested in, and so the first chapter on film appreciation is about this. It's about trying to think about how do certain types of forms elicit an intellectual but also a bodily response to cinema, and how do people try to practice or to develop that bodily engagement. So really the project is like, are art films cut pieces? That's only for that section. It's not going to go into the book. So definitely the methodological question is one of the things that drives me in this. So how do you then come to really experience or really describe or engage with the relationship that exists between the screen and the subject, the spectator? And what happens when that spectator is a collective? And so that's in the second chapter about the screen. And in a way, I think that anthropologists in any case, their only access to the world is through the body of the ethnographer itself. Film studies scholars are also doing this all the time. They just describe it in a very different way. They will say, you know, there was a low angle shot which generates in the audience these types of responses. And exactly. So there's all the time implied. And so my question is, how can you get closer to who that spectator is? And of course, the larger question, that overarching question, if we agree that visual culture transforms society, then let's get close to that moment. But it is, as you say, it's very difficult. Now, the things that you can get closer to are these modular forms. So the film screening that gathers people around it, who then have tea and have conversation. Often they have it at sites that have been already determined to be political, like the Goethe Institute Auditorium, for example. I know this, maybe not, you know, or before, when 60 millimeter projection was largely held by the diplomatic missions, you would have to go to the French embassy or to the Germans or to the Indians to go and see particular types of films. So and that's also why the government got so upset, right? That they had to put a separate, so unlike elsewhere in South Asia, Bangladesh is the only place where alongside the film censor code, you have a Film Club Regulation Act, which is a sort of like extraordinary paranoia about people watching things together in spaces that can't be controlled by the state, right? And so I think those are the modular forms that I'm looking at, and those will hopefully be described well enough in the censorship and surveillance. Yes, so I try to describe what happens in a space when a film emerges. I look at myself, what I feel when that, and of course I interview people. Of course I've talked all the time to what did you, but of course that is a second level analysis of what happens in that moment. I mean, I think all ethnography in a way is, you can't really get beyond, I can't get beyond myself and my own positionality. And you know, in the cut piece work, that was very clear. I was a white woman wandering into a rural cinema hall. Like, there was no getting away from the fact that I was the only one experiencing this in a particular way. And the whole screening of these films would be calibrated because I was there, right? Absolutely, yes. I don't. The ethnographic, yes. No. The interview is not. I mean, the interview does other sorts of things. Yes, yeah. But it's not my primary means of gathering information. I don't think. Yeah, I mean, it's, yeah. Watching films with other people is an emergent practice. Definitely, definitely. Yeah. Thank you.
I think. All right, we have. Okay, I'll just add a bit of a question here. So I'm just curious. You know, how do you really distinguish, if you distinguish at all, between this film society movement and film clubs? Although, I mean, you know, in terms of state regulation, we have a film club regulation, but how do you really think, you know, film societies operate generally, and especially in the case of, you know, Bangladesh, because you've talked about a lot of about Shahbag movement, you know, all these uh, meta-narratives, you know, these nationalist discourses, they really inform film societies, and at the same time, you know, the whole film society movements also inform them. So how do you really think, you know, hegemonic state power really operates, especially when film societies has, you know, they have always been kind of like playing a role of more like a countercultural role, I would say, rather than being part of the mainstream. But I see, at least in these days, at least in the university film societies or clubs, they're more veering into trying to get accommodated in the mainstream, because you have OTT platforms, and other channels which are more mainstreamed. And I mean, otherwise we wouldn't have those accesses before these platforms were not here. So yeah, maybe you can respond to that, and we can also take that question if you want to. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's so. So the interesting in the 1960s, clubs is the term, and Alamgir could be right about. So I think whether it's a club or a society that is neither here nor there. I don't think that these are interchangeably used. But of course, there's a difference between those film societies that just screen and people come and gather and have tea, and those who try to also sit and study, and who at another moment would also train those who are going to come and make films. Now, within that broad range of things, there's always been those who've been extremely politically active, and those who have been there for the art, and those who've been there for the fact that you could, see Swedish films with naked ladies in it, and those who came there because it was a mixed gender crowd and you could hang out with friends in an environment that was acceptable. So that I think the film society movement has always contained all of these things at the same time, and I think that's the ways in which it works. Now, the nationalist aspect of it, of course, I think is very hard in the contemporary moment. If you look at the types of people and the types of film that are being made at the moment, then certain types of nationalist generic aspects are emerging in all sorts of different films. So I think there's a huge project to be done here about the ways in which the cinematic representation of what can be broadly called the war film recuperates particular stock tropes, stock scenes, stock characterization that then emerge in these very different aesthetic formats. The art film, the popular film, right? And we've seen that now in the kerfuffle around the funding, right? About making particular types of films that comes with a particular nationalist agenda, and who is supposed to be making that. Now, the question is not whether these people would make very different sorts of films. In fact, they will make all the same film, but their aesthetic texture will be totally different. So some will be extremely what we know as an FDC film, popular. We know the types of shots that will come in there, while others will have. But the basic narrative is set. So I think, but it's of course interesting trying to think back to other types of films. Let's see, films like this, and to try and think what are the historical roots by which this type of narrative has come to settle into an almost undifferentiated pattern into these different levels of filmmaking. And I think it's a really fascinating process. The fact that there has been a hegemonic capture, I think the film society movement allows us to see something that happens all across society, and it's almost impossible to speak out with those terms. And I think that's one of the huge challenges. And there's a parallel movement, and this is a moment when every single gallery in Dhaka is buzzing with activity, because of all the foreign visitors. That there's also often a sort of tendency to then engages within particular frames of dissent or activism, also indiscriminately, right? So I think these two forms are so available to gather all sorts of aesthetic practices under, that what comes to constitute the hegemonic narrative and what comes to constitute dissents against that have become completely polarized, and also therefore no longer fine-grained. They're very clearly opposite, and there's no space in between. And I think filmmakers probably struggle with this. I would think film viewers, it's a different question, I would say. It's a very ineloquent answer to your good questions.
Hello, Lotte. I'm Topu. I'm from, I studied JNU, School of Arts and Aesthetics, and then I actually find your book, the Cut Piece Obscenity, and it is actually it changed a lot of ways of my views, how to read Bangladesh from a cultural studies point of view. It's that time when I was studying, reading your book in 2017, then I find out you should actually get through this film society movement, because some points I actually missed but it was like the narration and the way you actually went through the journey, it was really amazing. But then I was like, I had a chance to review the book. Like I was like working on these things. I'm really fascinated to read this book. I was also part of University of Dhaka Society, Dhaka University Film Society, and then one thing always like comes to my mind, that when you think you will work on a subject, it always like end of that era, because right, like in that time it was cut piece, that period of time is over, then like we find a book. And then now what I'm from my journey, I think that film society movement, yeah, of course it's a students movement, most of the movements, like after we went through that, there are lots of some few other film society movements, but from 2015, 16 and 17 it's diluting, where like even you want to go outside of the university campus, or like our connection is always inside the room, like we have to come inside the room and then project outdoor exhibition, or like everything is like there are lots of ways of can we get the sponsor, like who will cover the, because film society cannot own a projector, we don't have projector, for that we always need some money to come across. And then when I was going through some other universities film society, they don't want to call themselves a society, because there is a question that why we come across a film society thing, because Dhaka University Film Society believes that Satyajit Ray, what he wanted to do, that with the film society movement, there will come some better viewers. But here, like right now, there is lots of funding crisis, that we have to come with the like adopt the popular cinema. So what is happening with the Amar Bhasha Chalachitro is that with some other films that we really want them to observe, like we have to come with the popular cinemas, and there of course like we need permissions always. So that's a like hard travel to get across. So that's one, or like one particular question is that uh, is it your study like research methodology that you'll observe through it, you'll go through it, and then you will come with a particular point of view. And then another the small thing is that as a foreigner, like when you see through this land, if I think that do you have any point of view to go through the decolonization view, that uh, how do you actually cross that line, that reading this we have this colonial effect here, but as a researcher, or when you write, or anthropologist, when you write, how do you break that line, that I don't want to see you as a foreigner who is reading me, and you know uh, because in a point of view, I find that thing you are not related so much, but you went through a long journey, gives me lots of data, but some view I actually missed. But I'm of course like your last. I read your last article on our film archive, how there is a film hospital and how they cut the films from the 1947 and till 71, the genius photos. uh, the film archives activities on how they actually censored the genius images from the clips. So that's thing like, how do you cross that line from the, like as a foreigner, from the West, like when you try to read the land, or what happened here with the film society, like from that decolonize, like for colonial point of view, or there are lots of you know critical views on that, like how West actually making our history. So this is uh, two questions.
So thank you for these very helpful comments, and thank you for engaging so closely with my work. I really appreciate that. Definitely, the end of an era is always emergent, right? So the film society movement might be dead, television might be dead, cinema might be dead, but then there's always some sort of resurgence. And cinema, like fine art, is attached to commerce in a fundamental way, and it was like that in the film society. There is no sort of glorious or nostalgic moment in which these two things were not always somehow gathered together. And in fact, the film society movement is an important part of that, as it was always dependent on all sorts of Western interests that have been centrally part of providing screening space, prints, support. And so I think that, whichever way we look at it, you are involved, right? I am involved in this. I have been part of this in the ways in which these embassies, international cultural organizations have always shaped these types. So while I understand what you're saying about how does the West engage with this, the West has shaped the movement in itself in really profound ways. And I think it's important for us to try and work out what those ways are. And that's also what drives some of my interest in my projects upcoming, which are more about the very early days of the ways in which mobile cinema. And so some of this comes in here from the archive, right? So the archive is really important to try and understand where that comes from. And so the ideas, I think, Babubai is sitting here. I think the Film Society movement is alive and kicking. And it's not necessarily something that is at the end of its trajectory. And my interest in being in conversation with film society activists is the same way that I'm interested in being in conversation with other types of film scholars, people that are film enthusiasts, cinephiles, right? Because there's something really important trying to think through the place of the moving image in society, and this is everywhere. The final thing I will say is that the film society movement is also interesting because it emerges out of, in the 1940s, in the UK, out of a left-wing progressive mobilization that's very close to the idea of providing extracurricular education for proletarian groups, including in Scotland, which is where I'm based. And so there is something fascinating in trying to see the history of this as it moves across the globe. And of course, by the time it gets to Satyajit Ray and the Film Society movement in India, it has fundamentally transformed, but it is still closely attached to the colonial state. And we see the legislation that comes out of, the desire for new publicity units, for example, that then come to play a major role in East Pakistan as well. So I'm trying to follow some of these linkages. And for me, it's a very productive way of trying to think about the entanglements that colonialism has endowed all of us with that continue to shape the ways in which we engage, for example, with popular, commercial, but also art film. I'm sure that's not a complete answer to your question, but thank you for it.
If we don't have any more questions, I think we can take one comment from Saidia.
Hi, thank you again for a very exciting conversation on film society movement in Bangladesh. Mine is more of a, I'm curious about, because I assume you have done your fieldwork from 2013 onwards. Around the same time, it was also very interesting moment for Chittagong Hill Tracks, where the Hill Film Festival had started its journey, and the 5th edition had happened in the, I think in 2020 or 2021, which also came to Dhaka. And how do you include the Joom Film Society as a movement in your narrative of film society movements in Bangladesh, and the observation you made in relationship to the larger changes our changes in our relationship with the screen, what happened in plainland or in the majority population, Bengali majoritarian culture, and how do you see the difference in Chittagong Hill Tracks, where it has largely been under military occupation, even if it's not recognized. So I was just wondering, how do you include that part of the story into your narrative?
It's an excellent question. And I think, so I have not followed the movement and I have not done any fieldwork out there. I also don't have the expertise in any way to really engage with that properly. And I think, there's definitely lots of work that can be done. It's not me who's going to do that, not be best positioned. But I am tracking the ways in which the engagement of film societies like Moviana are engaging with local film enthusiasts, film groups, to give film appreciation courses, film screenings, film festivals that often are the germ for these types of local forms that then emerge in ways that are very different from, let's say, what happens in Dhaka or in the universities around. because of the conditions of their emergence. So whether this is in Sylhet or whether it's in Chittagong Hill Tracks, wherever this is, this provides a very particular way of allowing that movement to come to fruition there and the conditions under which those films are made. I did follow a while, because I'm interested in censorship, the ways in which it was impossible to think about films that were not either in English or in Bangla, and how that didn't allow a censor certificate to be given. And so some films were premiered abroad as the only way of coming back. So that is the only part where I have looked at it. But it's definitely a really important site for research that I hope somebody will want to take up, for sure. Thank you.
Do you have any more questions? I don't think we have. Just to add to what Saidia just said, I think it was just last December, Ruang Collective Arts, they had actually screened City Lights, if I'm not mistaken, in 3 villages of Lama. So, there's a bit of film activity going on right there. And I mean, especially, it might just inform your research even more. Something that you can think about and incorporate. All right, if we don't have any more questions, I think we can wrap this up. We have some snacks and some tea just outside the door. So please help yourself and we can maybe carry on this conversation afterwards. Thank you so much for joining. I'm not sure if do we have the sign sheet? We do? All right. So we have a sign sheet outside. So if you want to be invited to our next programs or if you'd like to know about them, please leave your name and email and then we'll reach out to you. Thank you so much for joining and thank you a lot for your wonderful conversation. All right. Thank you so much.